Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the fourth webinar in our HX Grow series. The speaker is Fiann Nualláin, and most of you will have really enjoyed his other webinars up to now. And the series is sponsored by Dublin City Council. So the theme for this evening is watering plants and feeding plants. And as before, you're welcome to type questions in the Q&A. And after Fiann's talk, which will be 45 minutes, we'll discuss the questions then. Over to you, Fiann.
Hi, everybody. You're welcome back. I guess the reason why this one is feeding and watering is, and again, this is a spoiler alert, this is giving it all away in the first sentence, is that if you can match your feeding regime to your watering regime, you'll have ultimate success. Too often what happens is when we feed, the feeding becomes like an afterthought. It's only when plants are sickly, or it's whenever you get the chance to get a lot of compost or a lot of leaf mold. And really, your rose doesn't need 14 horses worth of manure in one go. It needs gentle feeding throughout the year. So by matching your feeding to your watering machine, as in little and often, is better than too much in one go. That's the secret. So by putting the two of them together, I mean, we could have done one webinar just on watering techniques, and another one just on feeding. But by matching them together, I want us to match that in our minds, that watering and feeding are not separate things. That doesn't mean you feed every time you water. That just means that if you can link your feeding in to know, okay, every second week I'm going to add X or Y into the watering can, that's your way of doing it, instead of just bulking the feed up front, because that's just like having a big heavy meal and then having to run the marathon. For some people that's great, they've carbo loaded, but for a lot of us it's just too stodgy and we're not able to cope with it. So that's what happens very much with plants in the garden. They're not used to big feeds. They're used to eking out their existence from what's already in the soil. So I'll come back to feeding the soil. I spoke a bit about that in previous talks. It's something I'll go on about ad nauseum, because it's probably the most important thing that you can do in gardening. It's like basically having a good breakfast for your day. If you can feed the soil, you've set the plant up to extract what it needs when it needs it, and then you're not having to fret what's the context of the nutritional requirements of every single plant in your garden. They'll do it themselves. But first up really is the watering side of stuff, because that's something we do with the most frequency. And that's probably something that takes, the most amount of skill in a way, or at least, a bit of insider knowledge to get you set up right for doing it. I mean, you can splash water around, the plant will take what it needs, everything seems grand, but not necessarily, because are you giving it enough water? Are you watering at the right time of day? Is it actually the right quality of water that you're giving the plant? So let's start off by why we water a plant. So we water a plant because plants need water for a couple of different activities. So the first thing a plant needs water for is to maintain its turgor pressure. So its turgor pressure is basically its ability to stay upright. So whenever we see a plant drooping, wilting we technically call it, so any wilted plant is a plant that doesn't have enough water in the spine of its stem to be able to maintain an upright position. So that's the easy trick in terms of knowing which plants need watering and which plants don't need watering, is anything that's drooped over, or maybe say you're looking at your hedge or you're looking at a bush and it's a woody plant. Well, it's not really going to be able to dip or faint the way your herbaceous perennials are, but the leaves may start to curl up, or the leaves may start to become much more floppy. So these are the telltale signs that that plant needs water, and that plant needs water now. So it doesn't matter what time of the day it is, doesn't matter whether it's full sun, doesn't matter whether it's snow on the ground, doesn't matter what's going on, that plant doesn't have enough water. The turgor pressure in terms of keeping plants upright is, once the plants are kept upright, the xylem and phloem, which are basically their veins, their arteries within the system that take nutrients from the roots up to the leaves and take glucose and chlorophyll and other agents that have been synthesized in the leaves and bring her around the plants to feed it, to repair it, to spore on new growth, to go down and develop new roots. They can actually function properly. Naturally enough, if they're bent over, think of your garden hose. If it gets a kink in it, the water stops, or it turns into just a drip rather than a spray. The problem there is the circulatory system of the plant isn't functioning to its optimum. If it's not functioning to its optimum, the plant is slowly dying. So once you see a wilted plant, the best thing we can do is to get it back into that upright position by giving it a good drink of water. If you see folded over leaves, which are again, it's just a wilted leaf rather than a wilted stem. The problem there is our leaves have lots of pores all over them. And those pores open and close in what's called gaseous exchange. So how they open and close is the plants, all plants perspire. It's called transpiration. So they open and close their pores to let water vapors out. And as the water vapor goes out, some CO2 goes in, like oxygen comes out as well, and CO2 goes in. And that's the respiratory system of the plants, the way they give off oxygen that we intake, and then we give out carbon dioxide, and other elements on the planet give out carbon dioxide. And this gaseous exchange is not just our plants are the lungs of the world. This gaseous exchange is how the plant gets the CO2 that it can break down in its chloroplast and mix with water that it has absorbed from its roots and turn it, change the chemical bonds and turn it into glucose. It's energy, it's fuel. So just as we have glucose, the sugary substances, plants make up their own plant version of that. And that's what drives all of their metabolic actions, all of their growth spurts, all of their movements to flower, to set seeds, to produce new roots, and also the defense mechanism. So a wilted plant is basically a plant that's been denied the opportunity to open and close and make its own food and have proper living functions going on. So the biggest danger to a plant is a lack of water or an overwatering, because the overwatering can stop that transpiration from happening as well, because there's just too much there that the plant isn't able to open, close, and perspire off enough, and that puts it into distress, and then its functions slow down. And what happens is that the root zone, where the roots are too wet, it starts to develop rot and not absorb nutrients, and slowly but surely your plant dies. So the two common mistakes in watering is overwatering or underwatering. And how you master that is kind of a lifelong experience with plants, because like it could have rained this morning, but then it could have been really breezy all afternoon. And if you think of like hanging your washing out on the line, your washing often dries quicker on a breezy day because the movement gets all of the vapors to move and evaporate off the plant than maybe on a quite sunny day. Now, of course, if you have a sunny day, your washing dries in a flash. The same with your plants. If you water your plants and it's a really strong sunny day, you could have watered them in the morning, and by the time it gets to the afternoon, they're already starting to wilt. But the first reason, before we look at how much and how often and all that sort of stuff, it's known the reasons why we would water. So the first one is to keep its turgor pressure in, to keep it standing upright. And once it's standing upright, it's able to photosynthesize, produce its own foods, and we can rest easy that that plant is going to take care of its own nutritional needs and service itself in terms of what volatile oils it may want to waft on the air in order to deter insects or even attract pollinators and so forth. So if the plant is suffering, it can't do that. The second reason we water, the second usage of water in a plant, is that the water that gets to the root zone basically causes the roots to be more effective in absorbing nutrients. So the roots are osmotic, as in they absorb water from the soil, and in that water, where the water has made the nutrients that are contained in the soil, or even in fertilizers or manures or wherever that we've dug into the soil, they all give off their energy and their nutritional content into moisture so that the plant can absorb it. The plant cannot absorb solids from the soil. It can only take a liquid feed out of the soil. So if the soil is dry or the root zone is dry, your plant isn't feeding. So no matter how much manure you've put on it last week, no matter how much liquid feed you've given the day before, if the roots are dry now, yet that plant can't eat properly. So it's really what we're looking at is we're watering so that the plant can be self-sufficient in its own methods of feeding and building itself. So the nutrients that are absorbed from the soil are the kind of trace elements, and then the major components, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. They're all the stuff that gives the plant the right minerals to make it grow a root or produce a flower or swell up a fruit. And we'll look more at that a little bit later on. But how it gets that is it gets that through those elements being water soluble. So that's why we water. We water so that the plant can do what it has to do above ground, and more importantly, do what it has to do below ground. So that's why we water. That's one of the uses for water. Now, again, different plants have different requirements depending on where they evolved. And the kind of the next thing you need to do is look at, well, when do we water, for example? So the current kind of best practice is that you water first thing in the morning, early before the sun gets too strong. Now, the idea there is that when you water the plant, if you do it early in the morning when the sun isn't too strong, the water doesn't just evaporate off straight away. So the water has time to be soaked into the foliage and soaked into the ground and find the root zone before the sun comes out and makes it evaporate off too quickly. Now, the thing is, right, is that really in terms of foliage, and I'm blurring this kind of, where and when and how, when you water the foliage, it can only absorb a certain amount. So really where you need to be watering is the root zone. Now you can still give it a spray over if you wish, but really all your energies needs to be going into the roots, because it's a tiny drink it gets through its roots, where its thirst is quenched through its roots, but it's only a tiny portion that you get through the foliage. The other complication is once the sun comes out, if there are little particles of water contained on your leaf surface, they act like little magnifying glasses, and the sun will go through that and it'll either scorch your leaf outright, literally burn it, and you'll see black spots and brown patches on your foliage, or it'll cook up the chlorophyll and the sap that's contained within the plant. And all of a sudden, 2 days, 3 days later, your plant is starting to develop patches of dieback and what appears to be disease. But it's the fact that you've cooked it. The sun was too hot and it used the water vapor like a magnifying glass, and it cooked out the contents inside. So because of that, some people prefer to do their watering in the evening time, or well after kind of, the worst time to be out in the garden is between 2 and 3, because the sun is at its highest and we get the most amount of sunburn. Same story with the plants. So a lot of people, or a lot of different gardening books might recommend that if you can't water first thing in the morning before the sun shows itself, water in the evening. The complicating factor with watering in the evening is any plants that can retain spores of bacterial infection, viral complications, botrytis, mildew, all that sort of stuff. The water is a factor in them spreading around the plant. So if you leave that there in the evening time, the water soaking on the leaves of your plants for so long, that's where your botrytis and your mildew can really explode and move from one leaf to the whole leaf to the next plant to the entire garden. So I'd rather risk a scorched leaf than an explosion of a pathogen across the garden. So I prefer to water early in the morning, and only as a last resort if I'm too busy or there's some sort of complication going on, then will I do it in the evening. But then I will make sure that I'm not aiming the hose or the rose on the watering can anywhere near foliage. It's all for the ground, all for the ground. So in terms of the times, they are your kind of options. But first thing in the morning is probably best before the sun comes up. It gives it that little bit more length of time to be absorbed in. And then as the sun gently comes out, it gently evaporates off the excess, and we're not having to worry about mildew, and we're not really having to worry about scorch. But if you went out at 12 o'clock and threw water on your plants, then you're just going to do it more damage than if you didn't bother watching it at all, other than if the plant is wilting. If the plant is wilting, it needs emergency first aid, it needs water. Sometimes with the emergency first aid, often what people say is that they add in a little bit of washing up liquid into the water because it acts as a wetting mechanism, which means that the capillarity of the soil is more open. It's able to absorb more water quicker, so it gets to the roots quicker. You can do that, but I find that, you know, sudsy waters and stuff like that, they contain a lot of harsh chemicals, and it depends on what the plant is. Herbaceous perennials can be a little bit sensitive. Food plants can be exceptionally sensitive. Trees and shrubs, not so much. And I mean, you'll all know the old thing of the granny's trick of taking a sudsy water and throwing it over the aphids, and that doesn't do the plants any harm. In fact, it does good because it kills off the aphids. It kills off the aphids because the bubbles of the suds form over the breathing holes in the aphid. And once they breathe in that little bubble of air, there's no more air, and they suffocate off and die. But sometimes if you're overly abundant with the sudsy water, the coating of sudsy water, the layers on that can stay on the leaf and can strip off the barrier, the protective barrier of the leaf, its own natural SPF, its sun protection factor, can strip that off, and your leaf can begin to scorch later on. So at this time of the year, aphids are only kind of starting. The little bit of sudsy water here and there is not going to do too much harm or damage. But by the time we get to July, if you're having to throw sudsy water on your plant every single day onto the top level of it, you're going to do it damage. Sudsy water at the bottom can change slightly some of the chemical structures within your soil. Earthworms come up for it, but don't really like it. So I don't recommend that. There are commercial wetting agents that you can get, but look, we're not farmers. You know, we're not growing, we're not, agriculture is growing, you know, 15 acres of tulips for the commercial market. We don't really need that level of scientific intervention to help us grow. You know, if we can improve, as I was talking about in previous weeks, the humus content and the mineral content of the soil, then the soil will hold more moisture. Its water table will be much more available. It'll also be free draining, so that if it lashes rain for half of the week and then we don't realize for whatever reason, come out the hose and hose again, it will be free draining enough to disperse that water away from the roots of the plants, and the plants will survive. In Ireland, because we get a lot of rain, or because we don't get strong enough sun to evaporate off the water, then most of the time we're pretty much okay. If you give your soil a good structure, we're pretty much grand in terms of we're not really going to run into really bad watering difficulties. We're not going to get a hell of a lot of wilt. We don't really get a lot of drought. That said, climate change is having an impact. Some plants are coming in because we're warming up earlier, which means that there's a longer growing season, which means that they require more water than traditionally would have been available for them. So we might need to keep an eye on that. Also, we're growing more and more in containers and, you know, stuff like hanging baskets and things like that. We're pretty much, no matter how much it rains, solely responsible for what moisture should be in that growing environment, because the plants can't get down to root into the water table and pull up deeper reserves. So those type of plants tend to wilt quicker than garden plants because they just don't have access to any water reserves, and it's solely on us to do it. And last week when we were looking at kind of compost mix and stuff like that, I was talking about how peat contracts and expands and contracts and expands, and the fact that sometimes when you water, the water can just run to the edge of the bowl, go down the inside of the bowl along the edge of the root ball, and not really get into the center of the roots. So the trick for watering there is not so much the when, it's the how. Now, the how for me is always whatever about watering the foliage, and quite a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that the plant is going to take all its watering needs through its foliage. It doesn't. That's just like splashing your face instead of having a shower. You literally need to spend 30 seconds to several minutes watering the root zone of most of your plants. Now, really what you do is you don't want to be wasting water. You don't want to be having runoff going on. So if I talk about pots first, and then I can kind of explain how we can transfer that technique then into the garden. If we leave a lip of a gap between the top lip of your pot and where your soil is, if we leave, say, an inch there, and we water that rim all the way around, so we'd use maybe half a watering can to fill that inch up all the way around, that will sink 7 to 8 inches down through the layers of the soil into the heart of the plant. It won't all run off the edge, go down the end of the bowl and disappear off. It will absorb in. If you just give it a little bit of a sup of water, what you're doing is you're wetting the top surface, and the water isn't permeating down through the levels, which means you're only going to develop shallow roots. Shallow roots cause all sorts of complications for your plants, not least of all windrock. We live in windy Ireland. The windrock is going to do more damage to your plant. If your plant is moving around too much, it's under stress, it's transpiring more, which means it's perspirating off its water content even more, which means it's going to lose its turgor pressure, it's going to wilt even quicker. So the shallow roots means it's not able to absorb up enough water, and it's putting it under a condition that means that it's going to lose water quicker than anything else. So a really good soaking, rather than trying to give it a little dribble every day, a really good soaking in one go. This is what's known as wet dry cycles, and all plants pretty much are adapted to have it that way, that they get a good drowning, they absorb all the water, all the nutrients that they require. It's dry for a period of time, they accept that that's happening, and then they're waiting for their next wet cycle. So this is the things where we would have regimes in the garden. It doesn't necessarily mean that you go out with the watering can every day. If it didn't rain yesterday and it didn't rain the day before, then maybe you're out today doing stuff. Maybe you won't do it again, even if it doesn't rain for 2 or 3 days, until after the weekend. So it's tipping it over, but you get a feel for it. You get a feel when you're in the garden. Again, it depends on the type of plants you grow. Lots of Mediterranean plants like a dry zone. They don't like too much moisture. Edible plants need a fair old bit of moisture. Herbaceous perennials need a moderate amount of moisture, depending on which end of the spectrum they're from, so, or where they're about to perform. So, for example, something like bulbs now at this time of the year, where the bulbs are starting to go over, they're looking to bulk up for next year. A decent amount of watering at this time. Now, look at how they've evolved. They've evolved to be in April, rainy season. They've evolved to do that process at the time when the rains are there. If we have a dry year, it's up to us to supplement that. So basically the bulbs now, they want their leaves to be left on as long as possible to photosynthesize as much, to swell up the bulb at the base, and they want a decent bit of moisture so that the bulb doesn't start to dry out now at this point. And then they have a decent enough storage organ that we might dig up and put in the shed, or wait to plant for next year, or we might leave in the soil and it's there. It won't do any more bulking or swelling for the next couple of months, but it has all it needs. It's kind of set. So the when and the how much are kind of interlinked. So if a plant is flowering or a plant is fruiting, it requires more water than if it isn't. So there literally could be plants side by side in the border that need different amounts of water on the same day. So this is why stuff like drip hoses, and I'll talk about them at a later stage, probably are not as effective as you going around with a watering can, your eye, and your know-how, because you can just add a little bit in. Now, this trick of the pot where you water an inch and it sinks down 7, you may have seen in, places like St. Anne's Park or the People's Garden in the Phoenix Park, or, even stuff on television where people may mound up a little rim around roses or around camellias. They're trying to give you that inch, that when you water this little pit or this little created section, the water doesn't just spread out across the whole of the ground and the plant only gets 10 centimeters of moisture. It's that inch or so means that all the moisture level in it will soak down and be targeted and directed in towards the roots. Some people use like woven pipe and rubber cable funnels that are down planted in so that they can water, so that the water travels down into the soil. One of the old tricks used to be with the kind of fizzy drink bottles to kind of, you know, if you were going away and you weren't going to be around and you wanted to keep your pots or your house plants watered, that you would sink the pot, stick a few holes in it, sink the bottle into the soil, fill it up with water. If you put the cap on, it actually slows down how much drips out. If you take the cap off, gravity allows it to go out even quicker. So you put the cap on and slowly but surely it comes out. And again, there's loads of these type of funnel systems that can be put into the soil that gets your water to the roots of the plant, which is where the plant really wants it. Doesn't care too much really about surface watering, gets enough of that from the rain. If you remember, I was talking about putting the batter on the hedge, which is the angle you cut the hedge. There are a lot of people have their hedge kind of growing out over the wall. Now, when the rain comes in, it's not getting to get down to the bottom layers. Some of it is, it'll run down the stems, but if it's at the angle when the rain hits it, it'll run down the outer layers and get down to the base of the roots even quicker. So there's cultivation techniques that have developed that people often assume is about aesthetics or about pruning or about some other functionality. And really it's about letting the water get into where it gets. Even the spacings of plants in a garden is so that they're not competing so much for water and nutrients in the available space that's there. And very often companion planting, well, companion planting has become known as a way of attracting different insects and different pollinators, or using different fragrances to deter, like the carrot fly doesn't like the smell of onions, and the onion root maggot doesn't like the smell of carrots. So if they're planted together, they tend to go, oh, I don't really fancy here, I'll find somewhere else. Really, lots of the companion planting was about plants that, you know, a shallow plant that would take a small amount of water might be planted beside a plant that would require a deep amount of water. So that as you water the deep plant, the shallow plant just got what it needed, and then the deep plant has its reservoir. One of the big complaints very often is, you know, for anybody who lives by somebody who has a Nualláin hedge, is that they absorb so much water out of the garden that it's next to impossible even to have a lawn there, you know. And lots of people get all sorts of complications where they think it's the shade, it's the height of the plant. It's not, it's what's going on below ground. And really you just have to kind of beg the neighbor to get them to kind of cut it down and start from scratch with maybe, you know, a decent hedge, you know, a hawthorn or something like that, something that's going to feed the bees and the birds, something that, you know, you can eat the foliage at this time of year, you can eat the berries later in the year. You know, there's cultural connections to hawthorn with Irish tradition and all that sort of stuff. You know, more birds will nest in that than will ever nest in Nualláin, and it doesn't need a hell of a lot of water. It's adapted to Irish conditions. But, you know, again, what you grow in your garden, the reason why I'm bringing this up is, will have different requirements of water. So again, the when and the how, it's the how much. So it's understanding the climate and the conditions that that plant grows in. So say if it's a woodland plant, say clematis or woodbine or even camellias. Camellias are were traditionally woodland plants. Well, what they prefer is they prefer a cooler soil, again, because they're under the canopy of the trees. They don't get a lot of sunshine, so they're not evaporating an awful lot. If all of a sudden you have that plant planted in a front garden where a lot of sunshine, it's going to be working harder than it had evolved to work. So you're really going to have to water that a lot more. But if you grow it in the condition that it was in, so if it's grown maybe in the back garden beside a fence or beside a shed, which is casting some level of shade through the day, or it's planted underneath a tree or a taller shrub, it's shaded. If the root zone is moist with humus and well-rotted manure and, you know, leaf mold and all the stuff that it would get in its own natural environment. I mean, we're lapsing feeds and stuff in with this kind of talk. That's how plants traditionally feed off. They feed off the decaying debris that has fallen from the plant above it, or what has died near it, or what's available there. So if you can recreate the woodland conditions, which generally tend to be moister than the plant would get if it was just grown out in the open in a front garden, then it's going to survive and thrive a hell of a lot longer, and it's going to perform a lot better. Especially things like camellias and stuff like that. Also with roses too, you know, if they have a good humus soil, they don't get that thing where they get the bloom where the early morning sun kind of crisps up the petals and the bloom can't fully open up. So there's lots of things that we often think of as being a cultural condition. It's a problem of growing that actually has its basis in how we have watered, or what the moisture levels are in the actual soil, and how good or how bad the growing conditions are in enabling the plants to get access to what it actually needs. So watering, you know, it seems like it's the easiest job on the planet. It's actually one of the toughest of all of the different talks that we're going to have in this section. The watering bit is the kind of the trickiest. Now, we've already explored some of the key tips. Water early in the morning if you can. Improve the quality of your soil so that your soil will actually hold more moisture, so you're not having to waste moisture. And then the kind of the where and the how, you know. So the where is that you try to get it to the root zone. So getting it to the root zone is not that you're getting more moisture to where it needs to be. Yes, you're doing that, but getting it to the root zone means you're watering the right place with minimal disruption to the plant and minimal possibility for disease dispersal. So, you know, most disease spores and pathogens will be contained within the leaves of the plant. Some are contained within the soil surface. So if we're constantly top watering down, we are splashing these spores all around and dispersing them. If we're blasting the soil zone instead of, you know, gently letting it soak down and seep through, what's happening is we're splashing those particles, those pathogens, those soil particles up onto the top of the plant and creating the possibility for further disease outbreak or further disease spread. So in terms of that, this is where your different techniques of watering come in handy. If you do have a ridge around, I mean, you can mound up your soil, you can get kind of plastic and rubber collars and stuff like that. It means you have a focus point for placing your hose or for positioning the rows or the spout of the watering can to deliver maximum water to that spot without too much splash or complication going on. Also, by giving it the decent depth of water, you know it's sinking down. How I water is, whether it's pots or whether it's the garden, I go over it first, make sure that the top surface of layer is moist, that opens up the capillary action. Then I can go back and concentrate watering. Rather than just standing there and pouring water and pouring water, it's going to go over the lip if you have a barrier method, or it's going to just run off. Give it a water, go up the length of the garden, come down the other side, go back, and this run is your proper watering run. So you're giving it enough. So if there's turgor pressure, it's going to take anything from 4 hours to overnight before that's going to correct itself. You're not really going to overwater in that case. It's going to take what it needs to get. The rest of it will spread out. It's only if you are consistently overwatering, you're going to cause your plants a problem. Same as if you're consistently underwatering, you're going to cause your plants an issue. So then the different tools or tech that you can use. I mean, watering can and a hose, that does me. That has done gardeners for generations. You can add a kind of a timer to your hose. You can use a sprinkler system. I don't have a lawn because I don't want to waste water on just grass. I have a tiny lawn, right? But the tiny lawn is more of a kind of a flowery mead that's kind of self-healing, daisies and other bits and pieces grown in it. I don't mind if it goes a little bit yellow at parts of the year or wherever. I'm not that fussed. But these kind of billiard green lawns that require an awful lot of maintenance, an awful lot of chemicals to maintain them too, and a hell of a lot of moisture. You know, lawns can be the biggest drains of moisture than everything else in your garden to keep them going. So, you know, if you want to keep a lawn, that's fine. But I think these sprinkler systems, can waste a lot of water because they can throw water further than where they go. And they're never really designed to match the actual size of your lawn. Now, maybe as technology improves, they will be, but at present, you're often moving it into quadrants and you're watering stuff other than that. If you are going to use a sprinkler system, again, the morning time, early morning is better than late evening. Lots of people do it in late evening because the water pressure is better. There isn't the entire rest of the commuters in your locality all trying to have a shower and make a cup of coffee and all of that sort of stuff. So the water pressure is better at the evening time for doing it. That's okay if it's just your lawn, because your lawn pretty much isn't going to get bacterial infections unless you have kind of fairy rings and moss and that sort of stuff. But it's the overthrow of it. Is it splashing off your roses? Is it hitting off something else that's going to get black spot or a fungal infection or whatever? Again, your lawn, if your lawn has a fair amount of iron added in terms of a feed, or it has Epsom salts or magnesium added in, it will green up a lot more efficiently. It will photosynthesize a lot more efficiently, and it will need less iron. So one of the reasons for kind of feeding your lawn is as a kind of a water conservation technique. One of the reasons of feeding your plants, improving the humus of the soil. So this is this thing where we would top dress, because our plants are already down, so we can't like dig them all out of the ground and amend the soil and throw them back in again. If you're growing ornamental stuff, you would top dress with leaf mold, with manure, with homemade compost that you've made, and that will dissipate down through, and hopefully the worms then will move it around even further. The humus layer that's created in the soil improves the water covalency, that it's able to move around, get away from the plant if it needs to, be drawn up by the plant if the plant requires it. So one of the good things to do is at this time of the year specifically is to mulch. So if you mulch your garden, if you put a thick layer of, whether it's bark, some people like stones, there's all different types of media, but if you put a layer above it, what you're doing is you're covering up bare soil. So by covering up bare soil, A, you're not splashing around these pathogens, but B, you're not causing the evaporation of moisture to come out of the soil. The evaporation on the soil is hitting the sub base of your mulch, and it's staying in a layer. It's not disappearing off. So you won't have to water your soil as much. It's not losing as much moisture content. The big trick is water first, then mulch, so that you've already have a sub layer below. You're getting a base level there for it staying. Now, even with mulch, the water will, it will leach out, it will move around the soil. It will spread out under your lawn. It will evaporate off other ways. It will evaporate off the plant. So mulching alone is a great water conservation idea, but it's not the end all and the be all, and it doesn't mean that you won't be watering on a regular basis anymore. But it's one of the best things that you can do. There are fabric that sometimes people will prefer to use if they're growing their own edibles, if they're growing vegetables, because kind of pine bark and some of the other mulches can be complicated in terms of they can be heavy, they can compact soils, they can also be slightly acidic, and most of the food that we grow likes a limey condition. But a weed control membrane or other barrier methods can keep moisture in the soil, and it's still considered a mulch. Some people like to grow a green manure as a way of keeping the moisture in the soil, because the green manure will evaporate off less moisture than an exposed, than a raised bed that's left with nothing grown in it. It's exposed soil. It'll just keep evaporating water over the period of time. So the tech then would be, okay, you can put a timer on, you can use a sprinkler system, you can use drip hoses. Now the thing with drip hoses is, there are drip hoses that are placed above ground, and they're really great in kind of with a polytunnel and stuff like that, where you're bringing on new seedlings and you can tread it around, and that there's an even amount of moisture coming out throughout the course of the day, and those plants will absorb what they need. On the surface of your garden, again, because it's the same amounts, there's no moderating hole number 15 from hole number 155. So it's the same drip content is hitting that border all day. You can't, if you have mint at one end, and you have a hydrangea at the other end, they require radically different amounts of water. So they're both getting the same in that. So really that's, again, it's a handy way of leveling out the amount of watering that you're doing instead of just going willy-nilly with the hose on full blast. But you may still need to walk around with the watering can and target specific plants to top up their needs. Drip hoses below the soil, the issue there is, okay, sometimes the holes can get clogged up and whatever, but they're in the root zone. That's a much more effective way, because again, it's just closer to where the plant actually needs what it needs. Top watering, even in terms of house plants, this is why house plants have been, for generations, people have put them on a saucer and watered the saucer. Most plants prefer to absorb water from the ground up, or from at least below their root zone up into the plant. That's the direction it goes in. It's just a more efficient way of doing it. Your roots want to grow down. If you're top watering all of the time, specifically stuff in pots, and the water gets down to a specific level, your roots are down here, your roots are going to want to curl back up to hit that water zone, or your roots below the level are going to die off, and you're going to get shallower roots at the top surface, which, as I said earlier, means your plant is more likely to rock. If it's rocking, it's sweating. If it's sweating, it's wilting. If it's wilting, it's not eating, it's not photosynthesizing, it's dying off. So that's the watering side of it. The feed side of it is, well, when we feed the soil is more water absorbable, friendly to the roots. But it's also that, if we use, liquid feeds, we can use liquid feeds, and they're often known as foliar feeds, that we can use a foliar feed to treat specific complications in a plant. So if your plant is kind of yellowing up, that means it's lacking iron or it's lacking magnesium. So we can go get some rusty nails and throw them in a bucket. You don't have to run to the garden centre and buy something for $12.99. Put some rusty nails in a bucket of water, leave it for about a week, siphon that water off. You can put it in a sprayer, you can target your plants. Camellias and stuff like that, again, they require a lot of iron. They yellow up very quickly. That's a handy thing to do for them. They also like tea. They are, Camellia sinensis is the tea plant. So if you're making a pot of tea, whatever's left over in the end of it, you can use that as a soil drench or as a foliar feed. So the soil drench is basically a liquid feed that's added to the soil surface, and it'll absorb down through the roots. And a foliar feed is one that you're specifically targeting the plants to absorb those nutrients in through the pores to get into the plant. I only really use foliar feeds if I'm looking to improve the leaf structure, or if it's a complication with the leaf, like a pest or a disease or whatever. Everything else, I'd rather use a soil drench, let it get down into the root zone, let the plant extract exactly how much it wants to take itself, and process it in the manner that's most suitable for it and its current needs, because it knows what it needs more than I know. I might have a clue, if my tomatoes aren't doing well or are getting blossom end rot, I know, well, that's a deficiency in calcium. So maybe I'll go get a calcium tablet and I'll crush it up in the watering can and water it in. If the camellias aren't doing too well and their buds aren't opening, that can be a boron deficiency. So how do I get boron into the garden? You used to be able to go and buy boron in your local chemist, or borax, which was a treatment for ants. The last couple of times I asked, it was taken off the market, some European initiative, but there are still feeds with trace elements in them, which will have kind of boron, zinc, copper, all of the other stuff that our plants only need in micronutrients. And you can use that. Lots of plants use silica in order to increase their immune system. That's in a ton of weeds. So I love weeds because weeds are dynamic accumulators. They send their roots down far, they pull up all of these trace minerals into themselves, and they can be composted, they can be blitzed up in a blitzer, they can be left in a bucket to ferment, and then that can all be processed into liquid feeds. Even when I do compost, I love the idea of compost tea. You take your compost, you put it in a bucket. There's a couple of different techniques we have to do, but basically you're fermenting it on, you get much more bacteria content, and when you add that back into the soil, that bacteria content increases the earthworm population, but also the roots, the nodes in roots, how they absorb water and process the nutrients, and how the nutrients become water soluble, is that interaction between what lives in the root zone, the bacteria, the earthworms, the beetles, all that sort of stuff. So by improving that, by improving the macro and micro fauna of your soil layer, you're enabling more nutrition to get into the plant, and it will take what it needs to take. And you're not having to resort to going, oh my God, I need to feed this plant. I don't really feed plants as much as I would feed soil. So because I grow a lot of my own food and a lot of my own herbs, then that's grand. I have raised beds. I'm moving stuff on each year to keep ahead of pests and diseases. I'm amending the beds to suit the next batch of crop that I'm going to grow in each season. So I'm always on top of it. The sections of the garden that are ornamental areas, I will use kind of soil drenches and other stuff to get the nutrients in there. If you remember, I spoke about N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Your nitrogen is your leafy growth. Your phosphates, or your phosphorus, is your root growth, and your potassium is your flowering and your fruiting capacity of a plant. All fertilizers, whether they're chemically made or whether they're organic, will have the NPK rating on the back. So then you can see what it is. So if you're growing on tomatoes, then you might want something with more phosphorus or with more potassium in it. If you're growing on root crops like beetroot or carrots, you'll want something with more phosphates in it. If you're growing, chives or cabbages or kale or ornamental grasses, then you want the nitrogen for the leafy growth. I see a face popping up. Am I overextending my time? No, grand, I'll keep going. So by matching these, instead of thinking each time, so I will feed the soil. I know I fed the soil for the next season or for the next block. I'm not having to think anymore. If there are individual plants that are somehow in crisis, like with the blossom end rot or whatever, then I can treat that. So I'm vegan. I don't get opportunities a lot to boil an egg, but one of the tips is if you boil an egg, single egg, don't boil it in salt. A 3-minute hard-boiled egg or soft-boiled egg will leach out enough calcium from that eggshell to be able to maintain enough calcium in a grow bag with 3 tomatoes grown in it, and you shouldn't have blossom end rot. So if you're doing that once a week as part of your watering regime, that's your way of getting the calcium in. I have to nip down to the pharmacy and get some calcium tablets. And they say to me, my God, your bone's not strong enough yet, but really it's for use in the garden. Now, by liming your soil, and we spoke a little bit about that previously, your liming agent is a way of getting your kind of calcium level into the soil and fixing up the pH. Sometimes your pH of your soil, if it's too high or too low, if it's too acidic or too alkaline, it can lock up the nutrients that are contained in the soil, and no amount of watering is going to let those nutrients leach into that water, so your roots aren't going to be able to absorb them up. That's the other kind of exemption in terms of adding in a foliar feed, because at that point it's a lifeline to get it through until the pH of your soil eventually settles out. Now you may have to add an ericaceous thing to change the pH to stop it from being so alkaline. You may add in some more lime to stop it from being so acidic, and that will take 3 to 6 months, especially if it's top dressed. It's different if it's dug in, but if it's top dressed, it can take a long period of time for that to happen. So your foliar feeding there is getting your nutrients into your plants. This general purpose fertilizer is your NPK. It's often 10, 10, 10. If it's 10, 5, 5, or 5, 10, 10, or 10, 20, 20, that's designed for specific crops that require more potassium or more potash or whatever. As GI wires, or as somebody who's an avid allotmenteer, or you're just growing some veg out your back garden, you don't necessarily need to get that technical, because you're not harvesting so much out of the soil that you're really depleting the nutrients that's in the soil. Fair enough, if you grow potatoes, big heavy feeder, that soil, when you lift your harvest later in the year, that soil either needs a lot of manure to kind of bulk it up for the next crop that's grown up, that's coming around, or the next crop that's going into that bed. Why not put in something that doesn't like a lot of nutrients, so that you've allowed the potatoes to strip the nutrients out. Say for your alliums, for garlic and onions and that sort of stuff, they like a poor soil. you know, think of where they come from, Egypt, feeding the slaves in the desert, you know, not a lot of nutrients there in sand. So if they go into a site that's being depleted, then that's brilliant. If you want to get that bed ready for maybe growing brassicas, another point, you can grow peas. Peas are legumes. They take nitrogen from the air and put them into the soil. So in terms of feeding and maintaining stuff, we can do it through what we add into the soil, but we can do it through what we grow in the soil and how we use cultivation practices. Again, just coming back, just touching on the water, because this is where they're interlinked. If you're overly watering your raised beds all of the time, you're leaching the levels of nutrients out into the subsoil. If you're not growing deep tap-rooted plants in that spot, they're not getting the water up. You become even more dependent on having to water that raised bed. Your raised bed is brilliant for giving you extra heat. It's brilliant for giving you extra depth for growing stuff in, but it's raised above the natural water table in the garden. So you have to look after raised beds in terms of watering and feeding as much as you would look after container growing. You almost need to think of them as the same as container growing. So that's the kind of the link between connecting in your watering and your feeding regime. It's, again, by doing it as liquid feeds or by doing it as soil drenches, it's in the medium that the plant can absorb it. You know, all the top dressing on top, all the spent mushroom compost, all the manure on top, that still has to be broken down by insects, by beetles, by earthworms, by bacteria in the soil, and made into a more soluble form that when it rains or when you water, the plant can absorb it. So if you're starting off for a liquid feed, it's like baby feed. You don't hand the baby a carrot, you hand it mashed food and you can process it easier. That's what you're doing. You're processing the nutrients for the plant, and you're adapting what your nutrient and your water regime is to suit the plants that you grow, if that makes sense.
Thanks very much, Fiann. Um, that makes a lot of sense. I'm just wondering why I didn't understand all that before. Couple of questions there, Fiann. One of them is, how much should small pear and apple trees be watered?
Oh, well, again, so at this time of the year, when something is starting to flower, it can do with, you need to start upping your watering regime on what you have been doing. You've probably been doing nothing since you harvested last year, since, you know, October, November, and just leaving it to what it does. And it doesn't need a lot of water in that time. Once stuff starts to flower, they could do with a little bit more moisture going on there. So you might, you know, depend on whether it's maybe under 3 years of age, you might be giving it a can a week. If it's older than that, you might be looking to set up a kind of an irrigation system. I didn't get a chance to mention water catchment. That's an essential. That's just pure fact. It's get a water butt, stick it on your sheds. Never mind a water butt stuck on your house. Stick one on your shed. Stick one on the side of your bin if you can. Get a bit of guttering. Collect all the rainwater we can. Water resource. You know, it's not just that. You know, it's not just that you're saving the planet, it's that the quality of rain is much better than anything that's coming out of your tap. Your tap is hard water, and hard water causes magnesium to be depleted in a plant, which means the plant won't photosynthesize as much. So, you know, capture the water. So if you're having an orchard or a very productive fruiting garden, you definitely need better quality water than's going to come from your tap, because it'll give you more profuse flowering, and the more flowers you have, the more potential you have for fruit. When it gets to later in the year and the fruit are forming, you need to gradually up your watering. This applies to people who are growing on tomatoes and other stuff as well. Very often what happens is people let the tomato plant and it's looking like it's starting to wilt, and they give it gallons of water, and the water goes to the roots, yes, but the water rushes to the fruit, and then your fruit splits and then your fruit goes off. So with stuff like tomatoes and fruits that have the potential to split, it's a sustained watering regime rather than kind of lashing it in every now and then. You know, you need to kind of box clever on that sort of stuff. So that's the thing where it didn't rain today. Okay, I'll water now. And it's, again, it can be little and often rather than kind of gallons at a go. I know I said other plants are happy with wet dry cycles and they would prefer a can now and nothing for a week. With fruits, especially fruits with skins that can split, it's the sustainable moisture. But if you fed your soil, you see, it's already in in that zone.
Okay, very helpful, Fiann. A question there about acres. Will heavy watering help to prevent wind damage to acres?
Heavy watering in terms of pushing the roots down and making the roots make more firm contact when you plant is fine. Generally throughout the year, there's no real need for that. I mean, if your plant is staked in for the first year or two of it being in place, I'm assuming this is kind of one of the dissected smaller kind of acers, kind of your Zen garden acer rather than your kind of windmill kind of acer Norway trees, you know. So if it's your ornamental kind of Zen garden acer, very often people grow them in a pot and that's grand, and then they transplant them into the garden, and the root balls, you know, your root ball is big enough for it to be an anchor there and it won't rock around or do anything. I'd say at the start, water it well just for that, but once it's in the ground a month or two, really you can leave it to its own devices and let it sort itself out. Only if it's shallow rooting, and if it begins to shallow root and you can see roots on the surface, or you're aware that it's wilting and dropping leaves all of the time, you may have to dig it up, dig your soil, break up the hard pan that's there, which is stopping it from absorbing water from the water table below, replant it, and then you should be grand.
Great, thanks, Fiann. A question here. When I water large pots, I almost always get a lot of runoff, which feels like a waste of water and effort.
So that's the trick. That's if you can scrape off an inch from the top surface of your soil, water it in, as in give it say 2 pints of water. Let those 2 pints of water wet the top surface. Then when you give it half a can of water, it will be able to absorb down more directly towards the roots instead of just going to the side and running off. But if you have that inch or so lip on the top, when you water and you fill it up to the top, that will go down and you'll have less runoff. The problem, and people never really think of it, that when you grow in pots and containers, lots of people do it with kind of, you know, they have their spring bulbs and then they have their kind of summer bedding and stuff. It's continually being refreshed and the soil is continually being kind of upturned and kept light and fluffy, and, you know, there's no compaction happening. But when you're growing acers and kind of big ornamental shrubs in pots, over the period of time, that watering does compact down the soil. It does crunch the particles between it, and that means it becomes less absorbent. The water can't flee through, so the water wants to move off around the sides as if it's spilling off rock. So sometimes with those type of plants, you know, stuff like camellias that have been in a pot for 8 or 9 years, sometimes they need to be taken out. The bottom third, rather than top dressing, the bottom third needs to be refreshed. You might need to break some of the soil off the side of the roots, put it back in, repot it back up again, and allow the growing medium that's there be refreshed and lighter and airier and whatever. Now, it's a gargantuan job. It's not something you would do that often, but like I'm saying, if your plant is there 6 to 8 years, you might need to be on that wavelength, because it's probably not getting the water that it requires, and it's only going to die off in the next 2 years anyway. So I chance the gargantuan job. I would chance the, even like, you know, when you move a plant, it gets transpiration shock and it can wilt off and stuff like that. I think I spoke previously, if we get the kind of the B1 vitamins and B12 vitamins and add them in, plants get less transpiration shock. These are all going to be in your pharmacy now saying, I need, Fiann said I need Epsom salts and I need B12 vitamins and I need this. And the chemist is going to say, what's wrong with your knees? And it's like, no, it's for the garden.
A question there about feed. Well, somebody who's planting peas in a container, they ask first how they should prepare the soil, whether they should add manure, and then they ask should they use seaweed or liquid general feed
for peas.
Well, I'm not sure if that's a general question or in
Yeah,
general whether they should use the seaweed or general liquid feed. It's not clear.
well, the thing, well, peas are a leguminous plant. So all leguminous plants, peas, gorse, lupins, they all take atmospheric nitrogen out of the air through their gaseous exchange, send it to the root nodes and send it back into the soil. So they add fertility. They don't need a lot of fertility added in. If you have too much manure, if it's your garden peas or your mange too or whatever, if you have too much manure in the site, they can put on too much leafy growth and not enough flowers and fruits. So it's not that they like a really poor soil, but they're okay in a moderately fertile soil. the reason of adding in manure and organic material would be to allow the moisture content to be improved. So we do generally amend the soil before we plant peas. That's kind of where that's coming from. But if it's your peed seedlings, you can start them in anything, even almost dust. It's when you're planting them out, you want them to go into a type of soil that's going to be not so much nutrient dense, but that has that capacity to hold moisture and move off moisture. So it's a browny blacker colored soil that has plenty of humus and organic matter in it. But it's not necessarily for food. It's the free flowing aspect of it.
Okay. Now, there's a few other general questions we'll deal with very briefly. They're not about watering or feed as such. But
Okay.
before we do that, could I ask one myself?
Yeah.
About watering. You know, I've read historical material about vegetables being grown in Ireland in 16th, 17th century, whatever. You know, I presume there weren't watering cans around then, or did people actually water them, or did they just have soils that held water well, or trees over them, or what?
Yeah, well, the traditional, again, like that, you know, if it's farming practices and it's, you know, I live in Crumlin, and Crumlin was famous for kind of growing its own cabbages and stuff like that. And there, you know, there aren't kind of springs and wells and whatever else going on. They would have had to maintain a watering system. There would have been, you know, maybe pails, like if you're going back that far, there would have been pails of water used. But there also would have been irrigation systems made out of wooden lats that you could water and run the water through. But very often the main practice there was to get the soil right, and the plants could pretty much fend for themselves. And it wasn't in a gardening context where you're constantly out and about and pottering, but there would have been scheduled into that dedicated watering times. You know, when you move a little bit, maybe 100 years on from that, that's when you start to get kind of journeymen and stuff like that, who are, you know, 2 layers down below the head gardener, and they have a single task. It's to carry the secateurs, or it's to water the azaleas, or it's to do it. And their job is they have the bucket, or they have, you know, the kneeling mat, or and that's their sole purpose. So by the time we get into kind of late 1700s, early 1800s, the agricultural practices are more focused on kind of irrigation, job specific tasks. How do you improve production, all that sort of stuff.
Thanks, Fiann. Now, there's three other little questions here. I'll ask them all together, and if you need me to remind you of them, that's grand as well. The first is about vine weevil. How do you treat vine weevil to stop beetles laying their eggs in container gardening specifically? The second one is about if you could recommend a source for buying native hedging like hawthorn. And the third one is whether you can give any tips for getting rid of early black spot on roses at this time of year.
Okay, vine weevil, landmines. Vine weevil are a nightmare. Now, that said, vine weevil tend to attack ericaceous plants more than anything else, because they need an ericaceous soil in order to complete their reproduction, as in they lay, while their eggs may be laid on, they pupate in acidic soil, right? So the reason how most of us end up getting a vine weevil in the garden in the first place is because we bought a plant in a garden centre that was grown in pure peat, and the vine weevil was in there. That's where it came from. It did now. Subsequently, there'll be a generation in your garden, and it can fly over into your neighbour's garden and be there for a couple of years, and then fly back into yours in a couple of years' time. And there's this kind of vicious cycle thing going on. But it's the ericaceous soil is really how they replicate more. If you plant that plant out in the garden, the weevil may move out a bit into the garden, but generally what will happen is its populations will naturally decrease year on in when it's grown in a limey calcareous condition. The problem is you can't add lime to your blueberries or to your azaleas or your rhododendrons to kill off the vine weevil, because it'll also kill off the plant. The best treatment, now it's not just because I'm an organic gardener, but I find the most effective treatment. There are chemical agents out there that allegedly kill them off or allegedly sterilize them. I don't know whether that works or not. What I do find effective are nematodes. So you can get vine weevil nematodes. Now, basically, a nematode is a sort of a parasite that will feed off the pupa. It will go inside its system and it will eat it out from the inside out, kill it off completely dead. When there's nothing left, and then it'll move on to the next one. when there's no vine weevils left in the pot or that corner of the garden or that section of the raised bed, the nematodes die off because they've nothing else to feed on. They don't go and move on into other plants or whatever. So a nematode, it comes like often in a kind of a crystallized powder. You add it in to your watering can and you do it as part of your normal kind of watering regime, and that gets this little kind of natural killer agent, this natural parasite in to attack it. You can get nematodes for slugs and snails. You can get nematodes for various different pests. I think it's a very clever way of treating the problem. Native hedgerow, there's quite a few places that do it. The one that used to do it kind of mail order. Now, again, pandemic stuff, I don't know what way stuff is working, but there's a place called Future Forests in Cork. Their website isn't the easiest thing to navigate, I'll be honest, but they do various different mixes. There's Howard and Mays, which I think are out in Hout. They do it. And then, I mean, if you go online, you'll find stuff. Now, the thing is that the native hedgerow, very much when they come as whips. So they're like a pencil thick, and they're going to take 5 or 6 years to grow on. Sometimes people plant them at a slant or an angle, so you get all these lateral shoots in your hedge, thickens up quicker. You can get individual hawthorns in garden centres, but they tend not to be monogaia, which is the native Irish one. They tend to be other different varieties, and they may flower scarlet red or bright orange. That's lovely, that's nice. They'll still feed the birds. We can still eat the berries. We can still eat the foliage. You know, they will still feed the bees, but it's not a native one. So for the native ones, I would go with Future Forests in Cork. Yeah, they're probably the best one. And then the last question was
the early black spot on roses.
early black spot on roses. The thing is, if you've caught it early, you're on a winner. The trick is to try and pick every single leaf off of the plant or remove any of the stems that has it on. And, you know, it's one that doesn't go on the compost heap because the spores are there. So you either burn it. I still haven't figured out whether it's more ethical to in terms of planetary, you know, stuff, to burn it in your back garden or in your fireplace, or to throw it in the black bin and let it be disposed of that way. But it's, you want it gone. You want it got rid of and out of there. So if you've caught it early, pick off all the leaves, cut off all of the dead stems. You can feed the plants with a multi-purpose feed. That could be a seaweed feed. Give it that'll boost up its nutritional content. You can spray the plant with garlic. Garlic is antibacterial, antifungal, should kill off any of the remaining spores that are there. Some people like to remove the top kind of ½ inch of soil because any spores that have fallen down onto the soil can get there. The other treatment is to get baking soda, make it up into a paste with a bit of water, and kind of clean. You get an artist brush, you know, paintbrush, and go around and kind of work its way in through the whole of the rose. Now, again, that depends. Is your rose knee height? Is your rose shoulder height? Is your rose, you know, the 4 acres of your country mansion, you know? So you might have to hire help to come in and do it that way. But again, the garlic really works too, because the sulfur that's contained in the garlic not only destroys the pores of the black spot, but it also boosts the immune system of the plant, so that when the next leaves are coming through, they're a little bit more resilient. But early is good. You know, if you just said it to me in 2 months' time, I might be asking you to kind of put a black plastic bag over your rose, dig it up, and put it in the black bin. You know.
Okay, thanks very much, Fiann. You're a mine of information yet again, and great comments coming in during the week as well in terms of the feedback from the listeners and the viewers. So thank you everybody for turning up. And just to remind you that next week's talk by Fiann is about growing aspects. Is that right, Fiann? What plants to grow in north, south, east, west facing aspects?
Yeah, so what places, depending on whether you're putting in your front garden, your back garden, or which way your house faces, because that's, I think we had some of those kind of questions at the start. That's what people were kind of interested in knowing. Oh, I have a north facing wall, what can I grow on it, and that sort of stuff. So that's what we look
Yeah,
at.
there'll be lots of interest, Fiann. So thanks very much, everybody. Good evening. Night.
Thank you. Bye.